What's up, guys? So today we're going to be installing the crank for the last time. I took it all back out, so back to bare block. I cleaned the block one final time with degreaser and stuff, and with distilled water, and then air dried it. And then anyway, there's the crank. So the crank's been cleaned. Just cleaned all the caps, and I just wiped down all the bearings with acetone. So what I'm going to be doing is I'll set my bearings in the mains. Of course, you'll use assembly lube or assembly grease on the actual bearing face. So I'm going to be doing grease, driven grease, just because I don't know how long this block's going to sit assembled before I actually put it in the car, and the grease is going to do a better job, I think, than assembly oil as far as staying on those surfaces. Let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, everything's been cleaned, so I'm going to go ahead and put the main bearings in. Obviously, also make sure you're lining up the tang side with the tang reference in the block. So I'm going to do kind of like line up one side where the tang is, and then I'm putting pressure into this bearing just so I'm not like forcefully, letting it slide down in there. So it's a nice and easy install. There are the bearings. That's the tang I'm talking about. So now, this is what I'm using. Driven grease, and I will be using driven 30 weight oil for break-in. Make sure your hand's clean, clean glove. Basically taking some grease. Basically lightly coating the bearing. Alright, so what I'm about to do is off camera, I'm just gonna lightly lube with assembly grease all my main journals on this crank, and then I'll set the crank in the block. So I almost forgot, before I got too far, I am gonna use oil squirters on my build. I did buy block offs, but this will be a street driven car, not basically all out drag car. So I want the additional benefits of lubricating the walls and stuff, since this will be driven a lot more, than just trailering it to a drag strip, making a pass and shutting it down. So it's up to you, of course. Another suggestion, instead of running the factory bolt, you get a, let's see if this will focus, get an Allen headed bolt. This is 6mm by 1 thread pitch, and it's 25 millimeters long. So that's just the point of the button head Allens will give you a little more clearance for the rotating assembly to not hit the head of a bolt, the factory bolt that you typically would use for this. I technically still may have a problem clearing the squirter tubes with this piston and rod setup. I won't know until I put it together, and when I first put like 2 pistons in, I'll have to spin the crank and check to see if it's hitting. Some people said you can get away with kind of bending these tubes a little bit to give you that clearance, but if it's incredibly bad, then I won't be able to run squirters on this setup, and I'll have to do the block offs, which I already bought some just in case, so I have them, but my goal was to reuse squirters. So I'm going to blue Loctite these, and they are 6 foot-pounds of torque, and then the little dowel piece, I'm just kind of lightly, very lightly lubricate that. I'll just use a little bit of the same grease I'm using. So I'm going to lubricate that push it on down there. It can only go one way. I'll bring you in after I do one, and then you torque everything down, and then these are done. So you definitely have to do this before you put the crank in. You're not going to have access to that area. All right, I lubed these areas on the squirters. Go ahead and install them down in there. Bring it in real quick, show you. So just push them in, line up the bolt hole, super easy. They're in. Yeah, you can see they kind of raise up a little, so you do have some room to bend them down when the time comes. So we'll have to see once I start putting rods in. We'll just have to see if the rod or piston interferes with the squirter. Hopefully not, but I won't know for sure until I'm at that part of the process. So once you've lubed up the crank, make sure you're putting it in the right way. Very carefully set her in. So I'm taking my lubricated thrust washer. You can really only put it in one way. Let's see if I can bring the camera in. Basically, it's going to sit like this, smooth side facing the crank or the front of the motor. And you can see that little slot right there, and there's like a little ledge for this piece to sit in. So you basically kind of start it around and then just work it down on in there until that little piece is resting on that ledge. All the journals, the main journals. Same thing, make sure you take your tang, line the tang up, spot for it on the cap, and I kind of push it in as I push it down. And the number 5 cap has the thrust style bearing. Make sure you grease kind of on the sides of this last bearing, because that's where that thrust, one side of this is where the thrust kind of rides. So bearings on the caps are lubed. What I'm about to do is by hand make sure you put ultra torque. You know, these are ARP main studs. So basically follow ARP's instructions to the T. They're going to come with studs. So I'm not going to go over all that, because if you bought studs, you know, just follow this to the T. It's exactly what I'm doing. So everything's lubricated, so you install these by hand. I'll do that off camera real quick, and we'll come back and we'll slide the caps on, and then we'll go over how to set the thrust on the crank before you final torque your caps, and then the crank is, at that point, it is done. All right, now that all my studs are in, you thread them in by hand. I lightly oiled the threads going into the block, and then ARP Ultra Torque lube on these threads. I know if you notice, the pedestal mounted stud usually goes right here. I moved it here. I'm using a Gen 3 oil pan with a built-in pickup tube, so I don't need this section of this stud anyway for the pedestal. I moved it back here because I had to Dremel a small spot in the oil pan, because I'm using a factory Gen 3 Mustang plastic oil pan, and this was the easier spot as far as having to Dremel like a hole, just a little bit, just to have enough of a recess for this to fit up in there. So that's why I moved this pedestal stud from here where it belongs to over here, because essentially I could put it anywhere. I just put it where it's going to be easiest for me to Dremel a spot in that pan. So if you see that, that's why I did that. Thrust is in. So I just drop them in there, and I'm going to have to lightly tap them down. And you basically put the cap to where you can see the number 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1 being at the front of the motor. So you need to orientate the cap to where you can see the number. You read the number. And I'm going to lightly make sure that the cap is square on both sides, and I'm going to lightly tap them down to seat them fully. So you hear that loud kind of clack. So I'd bring you in. We can see the numbers. That's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, make sure the number is orientated to the front, the snout of the crank, the front of the motor. So now I'm going back to my ARP instructions. And what I'm going to do is put on my washers and my nuts, and I'm going to torque following their instructions. I'm not going to do the side bolts yet, those are at the end. But I'm going to torque 1 through 4, and then I'm going to leave 5 loose, and then we'll set the thrust. Okay, so I've torqued all my main studs except for cap 5 to 20 foot-pounds, inner and outers. I've hand tightened the outer bolts, but I did not put the bolts in cap 5. So now we're going to set the thrust. So the thrust washer is in there. So to get the thrust to align, to get that thrust washer to align with the thrust surface of the crank, I'm gonna tap the crank back, and then I'm gonna take a pry bar, and we're gonna take a pry bar in between a cap and a counterweight, and then pry the whole crank back to the front. So basically, as I tap this back, it's gonna align the washer with the cap, and then we'll pry it back. So basically they're now centered on each other, or matching each other. And the whole point of all that is, if the thrust isn't in alignment with the cap, then you have premature wear either on this last bearing that has that thrust surface on it, or the thrust washer. So if that thrust washer is not perfectly in line with the thrust bearing on this number 5 cap, then one of them is going to prematurely wear, and then you'll just have issues. So what I'm going to do is, I got my torque wrench ready. This will be set at 20 foot-pounds, so I'm going to tap the crank back, pry it back forward, and then as I'm holding that, I'm going to tighten these 4 nuts to 20 foot-pounds, and then I'll continue torquing the rest of my ARP studs. There, so I'm going to take a dead blow, give it a couple of little whacks. Get my torque wrench ready. It's already set on 20 foot-pounds, so now I'm going to take the crank between a counterweight and a cap. My pry bar wouldn't fit, so I got a pretty meaty flathead. So we've already hit the crank back, so I'm going to take this 20 foot-pounds, prime the crank forward, that's it. We'll I'll finish torquing the rest of all this stuff, and then at the end you'll check your thrust, the amount of thrust input. Basically, we're final install of the crank, and it turns nice and smooth. No tight spots. And the counterweights, it's pretty close to that squirter, but nothing's contacting. So now we need to, next video I'll be putting the pistons on the rods, and then we'll be able to install the rods onto the crank.